The Prime Minister's promise of $6.7 million to enable a replica of Captain Cook's ship the Endeavour to travel around Australia has drawn some ridicule, particularly since he initially referred to it as a reenactment. Many of us would know that if there were to be a circumnavigation reenactment, it would involve Matthew Flinders. But how many Australians could as quickly name the Indigenous sailor who accompanied him, King Bungaree? The co-chair of the National NAIDOC Committee, John Paul Janke, says all Australians are missing out when we don't know our full history. John Paul Janke, thanks for joining The World today.
Thank you.
Many Australian school children may be able to name Matthew Flinders as the person who circumnavigated Australia. They may even be able to name his cat. How many do you think would know about the Indigenous sailor who accompanied him?
Not many, sadly, not many. And in fact, asking that question takes me back to a trivia competition many years ago where I created a bit of a controversy where one of the questions was who was the first Australian to circumnavigate this continent. And of course, they thought the answer was Matthew Flinders, and I stuck up my hand and said, actually, Matthew Flinders was British. There was an Indigenous guy from this continent called Bungaree who was the first. Created a stir, and I think they decided the best course of action was to give everyone a point.
Tell us a bit about Bungaree and what role he did play in that circumnavigation voyage.
Well, look, to me, Bungaree, or King Bungaree, was probably one of the iconic figures of the early colony of Sydney. He was from the Hawkesbury, so he was Ku-ring-gai, and he came down to the Sydney colony in the 1790s, and he was one of the best-known figures in Sydney around the time of Lachlan Macquarie, so the early 19th century. He and his wife, Queen Gooseberry. Bungaree was well known to a lot of the sailors, well known to a lot of the British, but he quickly made his mark when he sailed in about 1798 to Norfolk Island, and it was a 60-day trip, and on that trip to Norfolk Island, he met a young English naval lieutenant, Matthew Flinders. Now, Flinders was so impressed by him that Flinders then took him on the coastal survey to Bribie Island and Hervey Bay a year later, and then again around his circumnavigation of Australia, 1801 to 1803, in The Investigator. So to me, Bungaree is one of those key iconic figures in the early history of Australia, but that hardly anyone knows about him, to me, tells a bigger picture of this country. And I always feel as though as Australians, we've been robbed of the true history of this country, and Bungaree is one of those classic examples.
How does it affect you to see Indigenous Australians seemingly erased from our history?
Oh, look, it makes me sad. It sort of points to, my generation and generations before were taught a certain type of history of this country. And it's a history that, didn't exist before 1770. When I left school, I could name more Native American tribes than I could nations here in my own country. And it's only been after leaving school that my hunger to learn more about the history, the true history of this country, and it's a history that I share with everyone else in this country, that it's our history. And I want to learn more about it, and I think that we as Australians should learn more about it, because that's what makes us unique. We are a continent that can celebrate 65,000 plus years of continuous occupation and connection to this continent. No other country can do that. And I think that should make us proud as all Australians, but we need to tell the true history and the real history, because it's our history. We share it together.
Why do you think we don't?
Well, look, for obvious reasons. It's probably what Bill Stanner in 1968, when he gave the Boyd lecture, said. It's the great Australian silence. The Indigenous history of this country is the great Australian silence. But I think, I think it's time that we embrace the history that dates back to 1770, the history that dates back prior to Captain Cook, when this continent was first being discovered by European explorers. We need to celebrate that, but we also need to acknowledge and celebrate and take ownership of that 65,000 plus years occupation of this country and history.
Well, the Prime Minister has been copping a serve in his attempt to talk about Australian history, initially calling his Endeavour project a reenactment. Now, he did correct himself, but what was your reaction when Scott Morrison announced $6.7 million for this circumnavigation, which he also said would aid reconciliation?
Look, I think it just leaves me flat. Decisions about, funding huge dollars to reenact the Endeavour and Captain Cook. I'm actually a Cook fan. I love reading Captain Cook's journals and his diary notes, because it's got wonderful stories of the interaction with my people up the East Coast. And I love reading about it, and I think it was a significant and magnificent achievement. But when I look at, spending large amounts of dollars on Cook, I think back to Bungaree. There are no statues of Bungaree in this country. The guy circumnavigated Australia with Flinders. He again went on a trip in 1817 to complete the charting that Flinders had missed with King. So he almost did a circumnavigation 1.5 times. There are no statues to this person in this country. You can walk the streets of Sydney and see magnificent statues of Apollo, Athena, William Shakespeare, Queen Victoria. You can even see statues of Flinders' cat, Trim. I think there are about 3 statues in this country to Trim, the cat that was on board the Investigator. And it breaks my heart that we as Australians don't have a statue to Bungaree that celebrates an iconic figure and someone who actually assisted in building this continent and building our nation's history. And I think that sometimes when things are put up that are divisive, we actually need to come together and say, look, let's celebrate something like that, but celebrate it in its entirety, because that's what makes us a rich country. That's what makes our history the best on this planet. And one of my great stories is that on the very front of the Voyager space probes that NASA sent up in 77, I think it's 79, there's a gold record. And on that gold record are songs of the world. And the only song from Australia is a Yolngu ceremony called the Morning Star Ceremony. And it's about Venus. It's a story about Venus. That's the same star that brought Captain Cook down to the South Pacific in 1770. So that same star connects 250 years of history as it does 65,000 years of history. And we need to celebrate that both cultures have a history with that star and this continent.
John Paul Janke, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
And John Paul Janke is the co-chair of the National NAIDOC Committee.